This module, we're going to be studying metaphysics. Metaphysics is one of the basic branches of philosophy, and it looks at answering the question, what is real? What is reality? Most of what we believe is real is based on what we believe in faith. As kids, we believe what our parents told us, often without understanding it, and only rarely testing their answers for ourselves. Most people, most of the time, throughout most of history, have believed that reality, which means the ultimate nature of the world, was pretty much what their religious leaders told them it was. Now, today, most of us believe that reality is what our scientists tell us it is. However, none of us have ever seen or felt an atom, and few of us have ever seen the farthest planets in our solar system. So this module is going to cause you to think about what is real. Thales was known as the father of philosophy. He's one of the earliest philosophers, and he was the first to ask, what in nature is real? Now, he was an eccentric man who once thought so hard that he actually fell down into a well. But he was also very smart, and he made a fortune in the olive oil industry. Now, he was unique because of the methodology by which he sought his answers. If he wanted to know something, he was going to find out. So he traveled to Egypt, and he was heavily influenced by the Egyptian tradition of worshiping water. The Egyptians thought that water was the mother womb of all things. Now, Thales questioned this with a balance of logos and mythos, or with rationality and what other people believed. It came down to Thales questioning their fact that water is the ultimate reality. He did agree that it was necessary for all living things, and it's present in most things and seems to be everywhere. There certainly is a lot of it. However, whether the world is made up of water is not really the issue. What Thales saw and what we now take for granted is the difference between the way the world seems to be and the way it really is. Modern scientific theory has replaced Thales's initial theory about water. And we now know that water is a complex system of elements and particles, and they use the same strategy as good old Thales. Back to logos and mythos. Logos is defined to be logic and rational thought. Mythos means the way that information is passed down from generation to generation. Thales saw that the true reality was a balance between what our logic tells us and what we've always been told by others. Our senses can tell us some things, but the role of faith may play a part in our beliefs about scientific facts. Back in early 2015, there was a certain dress that became a real trend. The big deal was some people would look at the dress and saw blue and black. Other people looked at the dress and saw white and gold. It was a phenomenon of how the light was falling on the dress. If people envision that it's located in a room lit by bluish daylight, perhaps near a window, they may see it as white. And our brain tries to remove the blue as a shadow. Alternatively, some pictured it under artificial lights like those found in the shops, and they did see it as blue. The true color was blue, and the argument was because it was a mother of the bride's dress, and everyone was condemning this mother of the bride for wanting to wear white to her daughter's wedding. Sometimes reality just depends. Her dress wasn't white at all. Early Greeks thought that the world was composed of earth, water, air, and fire. A philosopher named Anaximander identified a fifth source he called the indefinite stuff, or apeiron. Heraclitus is another philosopher who believed reality was like fire. And Democritus believed that reality consisted of tiny atoms. Now remember, this was pre-Socrates. One of the early philosophers that you may have heard of was Pythagoras. Now, he is a leading mathematician in the ancient world. You may have heard of the Pythagorean theorem, but he was also a very popular philosopher who settled in southern Italy, and he led a very powerful religious cult. His cult had views that were at odds of most of the philosophy of the pre-Socratic Greece. He believed in the immortality of the soul, and he also believed in reincarnation. And he established this brotherhood of religious believers who thought that numbers and mathematics were the reality and the basis of all things, and that numbers held a special place in the universe. His discoveries in math are still central to the sciences of geometry and acoustics. Then there's Plato. Plato was another early philosopher. Remember, he was actually a student of Socrates, and he went on to teach Aristotle. In Plato's view, people who devote all their attention to things in the physical world, like what we experience through our senses, they're like people who spend their entire lives just watching a television. They deal only with images and never with the reality that lies behind those images. To come to know this reality is the work of the intellect and the ultimate task of philosophy. Plato tried to correlate the state of being and the state of becoming. Now, in Plato's metaphysics, or in his reality, he considered that there are two tiers of reality. There is the sensible world of becoming, of a particular changing object. And then he said there's the real world of the being, what is. These are universal ideas and forms that are independent of our five senses. He believed in both materialism and immaterialism, what one could see, taste, touch, smell, and hear, and those things that were just universal forms. Next would come Aristotle. Aristotle disagreed with his teacher's two-world view. Now, Aristotle was more of a common sense thinker. He insisted that reality had to be everyday things like trees and people, not something other and out of this world that we never actually experience. So in effect, he brought Plato back down to earth. He rejected Plato's world of being and becoming. He did not, therefore, reject the all-important distinction, though, between reality and appearances that had been developing over several centuries. You see, where Aristotle thought the starting point of metaphysics is his rejection of Plato, Plato thought that we had either material objects or immaterial objects. Plato also defined the concept of forms. But Aristotle rejected Plato's ideas and just called them poetic and empty language. Aristotle wanted to focus on the real material world. Now, Plato had developed his ideas from within and applied them to the outside world. But Aristotle took his ideas from the outside world and applied them to things within. Ultimately, Aristotle's work in reality is motivated by a desire for wisdom, which requires the pursuit of knowledge. Then there is Descartes. René Descartes was a French philosopher and also a mathematician. We've already studied him previously. Some of you remember graphing on the Cartesian coordinate system that uses the x and the y-axis in algebra. But Descartes was also known in philosophy. He considered himself a pluralist. He also believed that reality was more than one substance, like Plato. These two basic substances that Descartes believed were the mind and the body. He spent a lot of time trying to discover how the mind and body are different, and then also how they're alike. He would ask questions like, how is it possible for something to happen in your body, like you burn your finger? And then that produces an effect in your mind, the pain that you feel. Descartes never solved this problem on how the mind and the body were connected. As we said, Descartes was a pluralist. And he asked those questions like, how is it possible for you to think of something in your mind and then that have an effect on your body? He even asked the question if the mind had weight and if it would take up space. He also brought up the question of God and how did God interact with a person's mind and a person's body. Now, he never answered the final question, but he had two perceived solutions. First, he thought possibly mind and body were not separate, but really the same. And then the second thing was they were separate, but that they did not interact. Then we come across Baruch Spinoza. He is a Jewish philosopher who insisted that God was reality. God is everything to him. Spinoza went on to explain Descartes' dilemma over the mind and body, saying that they're not two separate substances, they're just two attributes or characteristics. Spinoza was known as a monist, which means one belief in reality. He believed that God was the only true real substance, and that human minds and bodies were just attributes or characteristics that God had given one. Spinoza said there can only be one. We are in fact all one, and individuality is an illusion. This comes close to the idea of pantheism. Remember, pantheism back in the God chapter is the belief that God and the universe are identical. Now, monism does solve the issue of the mind and body interacting, but it does lead to this theory of pantheism, that we are all just really one in the interconnected fabric of God's existence. Then we look at Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher, and he was known as an idealist. So he specifically related with things of the mind and what their reality was. His notion was that everything we know to be true is based on our experiences in life. He believed that each individual person sets up his or her world based on their experiences. You see, to Immanuel Kant, there is no space, no time, no objects that are real. Just the ideas of what are based on our experiences. However, the nature of objects is not up to us individually. There are certain universal principles that exist and make objects work in a certain way, like the sun and the moon and the stars. Or just run into the wall of your bedroom and see. It will really hurt. Now, other ancient immaterialists who thought there was more than just the physical nature include Pythagoras. We spoke of him. He believed that reality was numbers. Parmenides. He believed that reality is unchanging and unknown. Zeno of Elea believed that reality is unchanging, and he even gave proof that motion is unreal. Heraclitus said that reality is changed with an understanding logic. Remember now, these are immaterialists as opposed to materialism. Materialism was the belief that reality was purely physical and material. But these immaterialists believed that reality consisted of some non-physical components, like a person's spirit or their mind or even numbers, as Pythagoras said. Back to Zeno. I told you Zeno actually presented a proof that made it look like motion was not real. Here is just a simple graphic of his proof. He said there was going to be Achilles, who was this soldier, and he was going to do a race with a tortoise. When the tortoise moves, he will create a new halfway point. So the soldier, Achilles, will get halfway to the tortoise every time he moves. But by the time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise is never there. So it's as if Achilles is not really moving at all. If he's only going half the distance, he, in reality, or in theory, he will never reach that tortoise. Well, How do we even test reality? You've studied a whole lot of history up to this point in the lecture. But basically, philosophy has two questions or two tests for reality. Number one, whatever is most real is what everything else is built upon. For the religious person, God is most real because that's what everything else depends on for a theist. However, for a scientist who doesn't believe in God, he or she may believe that principles and particles are most real because reality is based on them. Then question two, whatever is real cannot be created or destroyed. It would never change. It's real. You see, for the theist, we believe God created the earth and can destroy it, but God was not created, nor can he be destroyed. However, the chair that you're sitting in can be destroyed, but you cannot destroy those basic particles and atoms and forces that scientists tell us compose that chair. So it's a question in what your moral belief is. Now, it's also a question of your mind. We're going to talk about some of the immaterial or the mind aspect of metaphysics and philosophy. Back to idealism. Idealism is the belief that everything that's real is in the mind. Everything else, such as the material objects, are dependent on the mind. There is a question to raise here about the mind, though. Is it really a person's mind or our consciousness? Idealism thinks that even though this was never mentioned by the Greek philosophers because they had no concept of in the mind, their world was external and mental reality just never occurred to them. This is the main difference between the view of reality or metaphysics with ancients and with modern day. Today we look at idealism, the view that nothing exists except for ideas and the mind. Now there are three views of idealism, and some we've already discussed. There is Descartes. Remember how he believed he was a dualist with the mind and the body? Now Descartes also thought that God was real. And he thought that there were basically three types of substances. There were minds, there were bodies, and then there was one God. And he believed they had a casual interaction but could never describe what it was. Baruch Spinoza thought that we were all one interwoven fabric in just one substance called God or the universe. And he believed that these substances did not interact, that we were really just characteristics or attributes of God. Now, another philosopher, Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, I'll call him Leibniz for short, he believed that reality was all in a person's mind, and he even gave the word mind another word, monad. Monad simply means mind, and it was coined by Leibniz. Now, he believed there were indefinitely many monads because there were millions and millions of people throughout history. And then there was one more that he called God. Now, he called God the super monad. And he believed that the monads or the minds did not interact. They appeared to interact, but all that was orchestrated by God in his theory. Now, Leibniz did agree with Descartes that there was a plurality of the substances because there were multiple minds. But he also agreed with Spinoza that they didn't actually interact. As we said, the most basic substance for Leibniz were the monads or the mind. Now, there were three German idealists who believed that reality was in the mind. One we've actually mentioned before, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant says rules for happiness, something to do, something to love, and something to hope for. All these are things that are in our minds and that our minds tell us to do. Then there's this gentleman called Arthur Schopenhauer. He was a German philosopher who was known for his very bad sense of view of the world. He was a pretty depressing person if you stayed around him very often. Here's a statement from him. Reading means thinking with someone else's head instead of his own. He's basically telling you when you read something that you haven't written, then you're using someone else's mind. And then there's George Heigl. George Heigl says genuine tragedies in the world are not conflicts between right and wrong. They're conflicts between two rights. This is very true. Back to Arthur Schopenhauer. I said that he was probably one of the crankiest philosophers of Western thought. He was extremely willful, and he just heaped scorn on all of his contemporaries. He once even was involved with a lawsuit with his landlady. He disagreed with her and fought so hard with her he knocked her down a flight of stairs. His philosophy style was that of pessimism. Pessimism means it's the view of life which in general there is no good and no purpose. He believed that a person could actually will something with his mind to happen. Will is the driving force of nature, according to Schopenhauer. Despite his pessimism, though, he did enjoy good living, and he lived to be 72 years old. Now let's talk a bit about what the book calls teleology. It's from the Greek word telos, which means end or goal. And teleological theories focus on possible outcomes of an action. A teleological view of the world is one that thinks the world does have an ultimate goal or purpose, and that as we go through life, we're continually working towards that goal or purpose. Teleology is defined to be 1, the explanation of phenomena by the purpose that they serve rather than the causes, and 2, the doctrine of design and purpose in the material world. And teleology also puts an emphasis on doing what will cause the maximum benefit and minimum harm to society. George Heigl had a view that there was a universal spirit developing through history, and he was one of the more modern orientations that first coined the word teleology. However, if you recall back to Aristotle, Aristotle also believed that there was a certain force that was determining changes in the universe. He called this the essential force, which many believed referred to God. Modern scientists, though, discourage such thinking in terms of an ultimate goal as an explanation for why the universe exists. Since the 17th century, we've been taught to think of the universe as a giant machine or a mechanism that operates according to physics laws. But this vision of the universe as a machine seems incomplete to many thinkers. So what do you say? Both Descartes and the great physicist Sir Isaac Newton defended a mechanistic causal account of the universe, but they insisted God provided purpose to creation. Then there was Immanuel Kant. He was an enthusiastic devotee to good old Sir Isaac Newton, and he supplemented the causal view of the natural world with a teleological view, or a grand purpose in the end of the cosmos. Leibniz, remember, was the guy who called all human minds monads, and he thought that all human minds or monads unfolded according to the supermonad's purpose, or God's purpose. The idea that the universe is a great machine is relatively new, even though we've been inundated with science. But the idea of teleology is as old as Western civilization itself. The ancient Greeks were mostly animists. That meant they attributed some sort of lifelike activity to all things, whether it be, water, or whether it be the ancient Greek gods. Native Americans also believed that a vision of the universe is not mechanical, but that nature was very much alive and continued to move towards one great purpose. There are Eastern religions and African religions today who in their philosophy hold a teleological view of the world in contrast to our more scientific models. Yet many people believe that the universe does not have a purpose. It's just matter in motion. Is this the vision of the purpose of the universe, or is it about the meaning of our own lives? Does the universe have a purpose? Who caused that purpose? Was it God? Was it matter? If the universe has no purpose, what about human life? Do we have a purpose? These are all ultimate questions that we must ask ourselves at one time or another. How we live and what we do, what we hope for, even our day-to-day attitudes towards jobs, college, ourselves and each other, all this falls within the framework of the ultimate metaphysical questions that have been asked here. We'll go ahead and close this lecture with some quotes. First, Carl Jung. Life is teleology par excellence. It is the intrinsic striving towards a goal, and the living organism is a system of directed aims which seek to fulfill themselves. Do you believe in a lifelong goal? Or there's Miguel Unamuno. I would say that teleology is theology, and that God is not a because, but rather an in order to. Is God your because or in order to complete life? Then there's John Haldane. Teleology is like a mistress to a biologist. He cannot live without her, but he's unwilling to be seen with her in public. This one makes me chuckle because it reminds us that even scientists themselves cannot describe everything. Just as religion can't give us all the answers, neither can science. It's almost as if there is some type of relationship between the two. Gerald Edelman says evolution works by selection, not by instruction. There is no final cause, no teleology, no purpose guiding the overall process. So here's an example of a person saying that it's all in evolution. There is no final cause or purpose. And Richard Dawkins, he says the assignment of purpose to everything is called teleology. And I love this last statement. Children are native teleologists and may never grow out of it. Think of your child, or as you were a child, or if you have a child in your life, they always seek to look toward that ultimate purpose or that next thing. May we never grow out of looking for wisdom. Keep thinking hard.